We are about to begin. So just a bit of housekeeping. If you're new to the building and you're not familiar, the washrooms are right outside the common room. As you turn to your left, you'll be able to see the signage and you can access the washrooms from there. In case of an emergency, there's a green emergency exit right at the back, which you can follow and go through. And kindly keep your phones on silent. And if you have to take a call, then please take it outside. You can step outside and take the call so that we don't interfere with the program for today. For online participants, please drop your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll gather them for the question and answers. And we're really happy and pleased to have all of you joining us right now. So the flow for today is that we'll start basically just with a brief introduction of what to expect, and then we're going to move straight into the fireside discussion, into our guest talk on his latest book on natural capital, which you can see displayed right there at the front. And then we're going to open the floor for questions, and then we aim to wrap up by 3:30 p.m. So if you're here on site, please do stay on because there will be a book signing event after at 3:30, which will be right outside, along with some refreshments which you'll be able to take. So to start things off, I'd like to welcome you all to a special discussion being hosted by the students of the Masters in Conservation Leadership from the University of Cambridge. Just say hello, guys, and wave briefly wherever you are. We are really excited to be hosting and welcoming all of you to this discussion. Today's gathering stems from a memorable engagement we had with Professor Vira while studying natural capital in our second term. He promised to bring Partha to speak with us, and here we are today, ready to revisit our lingering questions and to hear Partha's insights. This is all made possible through the generous support of the university program Conservation Leadership. Our course director is not here today, Professor Chris Sandbrook and Dr. Howard Nelson. They've traveled, but we'd like to recognize them for all the support that they've given us through this process. We've also gotten support from the Geography Department, Professor Emma Mosley, who's here with us today, and also undeniably from the CCI Director, Professor Melissa Leach, who will be joining us a bit later today. So thank you all for your generous support and making this happen. So Partha has been invited by Professor Bhaskar Vira, who now I have the pleasure of introducing. Professor Bhaskar Vira is a professor of political economy and the Provost Chancellor for Education and Sustainability at the University of Cambridge. He is based in the Department of Geography, a fellow of Fitzwilliam College, and an honorary fellow of St. John's College. His research examines the political economy of development, especially in India, and political ecology focusing on forests, wildlife, land use change, and the social and political context of biodiversity conservation. He founded the University of Cambridge Conservation Research Institute and works across multiple interdisciplinary networks, including the Cambridge Conservation Initiative and the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. He also leads a major program on decent work and youth livelihoods, with a particular focus on the Global South, and was elected a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2021. Please join me in welcoming Professor Vira, who will say a few words and introduce our guest speaker. Professor Vira.
Well, thank you so much for this, and thank you so much for all the organization. So I want to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the conversation that we're about to have, which is very much that lecture that I did with the students on the MPhil in Conservation Leadership in February. And I do this every year, and it's one of my real pleasures to be able to speak to the students on that program. And I do a lecture on natural capital, and I promised to, instead of doing a second-hand account of Partha's work, to try and bring him to the room. Rosebell and Heisman came to my office in, I think it might have been early June, reminding me of my promise. So I immediately sent an email to Partha, and it's a testament to how much Partha values engagement with students that before they left my office, he'd already replied to say, yes, I'll do it. So we were discussing dates within 15 minutes of my sending that first email. So that's the history of this conversation. Partha, I think, needs very little introduction to this audience. He has been a leading environmental economist writing about these issues for several decades. I wanted to have the opportunity to talk to him about this, particularly here, because the economics of biodiversity, which lies behind the book that we're about to discuss, was commissioned some years ago by the UK government. And it had a particular history in relation to this building because the team that was helping to write the review spent a lot of time talking to colleagues in and around Cambridge as a build-up to the review itself. So I think it's very fitting that we're having the opportunity to talk about this version of your thoughts in this setting. I wanted to invite you to think about that genesis, actually. The review was written at the request of the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
That's right.
And I think that's quite a significant origin story in itself, because I think there have been many reports of this sort that have been written by environment ministries.
Yeah.
To have a finance ministry asking for such a review is very meaningful. And I think I want us to think about the symbolic nature of that. At that time, the Chancellor of the Exchequer was a certain person called Philip Hammond. He wrote you the invitation. Over the course of writing the review, you saw through 2 prime ministers and 3 chancellors of the Exchequer.
I guess that's right.
You eventually presented the report in February 2020 when a certain Rishi Sunak.
2021.
When a certain Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
That's right.
A couple of months later, we were plunged into the COVID pandemic. So I guess it's fair to say that this report had a fairly complicated birth, Partha. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, well, it was February 2021 when I submitted it. So we were in the midst of the pandemic. In fact, my writing period was during the pandemic of March 20 is when we, my wife and I returned from a month-long stay at the visit to New Zealand. And so we were well into it, so to speak. And so we're looking at March 2020, and the review was submitted in December 2020. My team, which is an outstanding team I was given to work with, some partly from this government, some from NGOs. They were hired work that we all want to do. So they asked a respite of 2 months. So submitted actually in February 2021. So it was written during the COVID years, that period. And in a sense, and it's a horrible thing to say, but people fall into different niches during trying times. In my case, because we're comfortably off, as it were, at the house, and just the 2 of us, my wife and I, it was the COVID actually helped the process of writing because there's nothing very much to do. We had no outside commitments, barring bicycle rides or walks. So I would wake up at 4 in the morning every day and put in about 3.5 hours of work writing before taking a cup of coffee to my wife, who would wake up at about 7:30 or so and knock on the wall. And that's the life that we led. And of course, she characteristically took over the complete running of the household and all the administrative duties that go with it. So I was left free to do it. And so although it sounds as though I didn't have much time to prepare it, to rewrite the piece, it's a 600+ page document. But I had plenty of material from the past. I've been working on these problems for about 4 decades. Articles and books I had written. And the idea was to put them together. And of course, in the process of putting them together, you come up with something very new. To me, at least, it was new. I realized that I'm learning a lot. Connections that I could now make, I had not made before.
Yes,
So that's the history of it. It is written about, as I say, about 9 months or so. And it was a very pleasurable activity. I couldn't meet my team. It was done through Zoom, and they were very, very able, and they were insistent that I work hard at it. So I was part of my motivation was not to let my team down. In fact, a large chunk of it was down because how would that look to them? So yes, that's the background.
So I know that a number of dissemination events had been planned so that the report would actually reach, as you wanted it to, a much larger audience.
Yes.
And almost all of them ended up having to be done online. I think you took part in several hundred Zoom calls to promote.
I should mention that, yes. Thank you for reminding me. Of course, I suppose certain features of your life you don't like to remember, you tend to forget. But I really was pretty bogged down by Zoom meetings for 9 months of 2021. That's absolutely right. It was extremely exhilarating. It was orchestrated by my team, and the Treasury showed. You asked, the Treasury authorized or requested me to produce the report. But what was to me very interesting and said plenty about the administrative atmosphere in this country. Is that my team was kept for the rest of the calendar year. So I had something like 11 months for dissemination purposes. And that's not exactly cheap because there were about 8-9 people. So, I remember that with good deal of fondness and admiration for the Treasury. It wasn't just the report is published, and that's the end of that. It may have been the end of that in terms of policy, but that's a different matter. We're talking about nurturing an output what they had commissioned.
But talking of nurturing the output, I know from conversations with you at that time and beyond that you were very keen that the messages of that 600-page report actually reach a much wider audience.
Yeah.
And you were very keen for that to happen. And I remember us having many conversations about that. So when you said that the publishers have come back to you and said, would you like to produce a slightly more accessible version? I was truly delighted. And that's really what we're here to talk about, which is, and I think your ability to converse across multiple audiences is a really important part of the way in which you're communicating. It's very interesting when you read the preface because you have your archetypal reader in mind and you sort of address her in your preface. So I wonder whether you could kind of start by telling us about, who is the reader for this?
Yeah, well, anybody who has written books, many of you will have done so or will be doing in the future, will know that no author writes without a reader in mind, a very particular face, so to speak. And in this case, my reader, for me, was actually a lady who I admired and loved very much. She was like a distant aunt of mine. She's been dead a long time ago, but we were very close. She's not an aunt. In Indian sense, she was an aunt, but not in the British sense. But we were very close and very articulate. She was a bird watcher and used to take me bird watching when I was in Delhi. Anyway, so it was she who I admired. And I referred to her as the concerned citizen. That's what my audience was, concerned citizen. And I think that's just right. And it turns out because it was a she, my concerned citizen was a woman. But it be otherwise.
I remember from attending undergraduate lectures with you that your hypothetical individual was always a woman. I think you always illustrated your lectures by talking about she as the consumer or she as...
I've always done that.
You have always done that for a very long time. Partha lectured me when I was an undergraduate.
I've always done that.
Long time ago.
I think so. And I think that's because back on my mind, I had my wife as a reader. It may well be she I'm addressing. Yeah.
So sticking with the preface, you made a very interesting observation, which is that although the Chancellor had asked you to conduct a review of the economics of biodiversity, in your opinion, this couldn't really be a review because there is no economics of biodiversity to review. That's a leading statement. So would you like to expand on that?
Well, I think it's a leading statement, but it's a pretty transparent statement too, and correct. it requires a sort of somewhat complicated answer. I'll try and be as brief as I can given the outlines of it. Economics does not have nature as a factor of production. That's a sounds bold and controversial, but it shouldn't be controversial because it's just look at textbooks. That's the leading way of, or mainstream leading economics journals. That's even better because that gives you a sense of what are the issues that are being discussed by the leading minds in the profession. And you will not find nature in it anywhere. There may be a few articles on climate change, but that's a response to. And so you have a situation where economists have written that and there's climate change and nature, as though climate change is not part of nature's processes. So you can see that how words matter, sentences we utter matter enormously because they define and redefine our conceptual apparatus. Language does matter. And in economics, somebody says that's not quite right what Dasgupta is saying because there is something called environmental and resource economics. That's for sure. I've contributed to it myself. But it sees nature as external to the human enterprise. See, it's like harvesting from nature rather than being embedded in nature. And there's a fantastic difference between the two conceptions. And there's a mathematical difference too. I should say, those of you who haven't read my earlier works, is that I'm a mathematical economist by training and also inclination. I can't resist writing down equations, no matter what you say. Something to get a sense of what the factors may be, a way of articulating what factors influence the process. That's all. And I'll come back to that, the question that Bhaskar has told me he will be asking, what the impact of the problem. So nature is not present in the economic models, except as a harvesting matter. There's an economics of fishery, there's an economics of timber, forestry. That's for sure, no question about that. But at the back of your mind is a human enterprise which is operating out there with a sea of assets, which are not infinite necessarily. The fishery is never goes without saying. So you care about the fact that you want to nurture it. But that's a very different conception from thinking that you're like you're sitting inside a home and the structure of the building matters so that you could wobble anywhere and get in trouble. So you have to keep an eye on various things. So that's point number one. And there's a mathematical difference too, and it does make a difference. The second thing is that the emphasis in environmental resource economics, because nature is seen as yet another sector in the economic life. There's manufacturing sector, there is a harvesting sector, there's a manufacturing sector, there is a labor market, and then there is a resource.
I got online just reporting some sound issues, so we're going to ask to switch to these mics.
Okay. Can they hear? Please send a message that you can hear me now.
He's a complete veteran on these Zoom calls, right?
And I apologize if I was inaudible before, but it's not my fault. Okay. Right. So that's the background. So there is environmental and resource economics, and there has been for many, many years, and it's a very beautiful part of our discipline. But it took nature piecemeal. That's another way of piecemeal. We look at identifiable environmental issues and work it. So it's like what those of you who economists you'll see looks at it like a partial equilibrium. You have a main sector, main engine of work. And then there is that. Now, one of the implications of that viewpoint was how to find ways to substitute away from nature if you're running out of it. It began with the coal problem Jevons had in the 19th century. Of course, forestry economists have worked about that. Fisheries economists have worked about that. But they were all separate sectors. So you might say, well, if that sector goes down, in principle, you can say, are there substitutes? If not here, maybe somewhere else. And a great deal, I think, a good deal of economic history can be written with this idea of leading economies trying to find substitute resources, and typically would be elsewhere, largely because biodiversity is extensive elsewhere, not so much in the countries like in Europe, which founded economics. So that seems, in some sense, to me, the background as to why it's been missing, and it has remained missing in textbooks and, of course, in journal articles, particularly in journals. You won't find nature in any dominant way in journal articles, even today. The final comment is that, in a way, I'm increasingly increasingly aware of the fact that what isn't there is not missed, because you don't know that it's missing, and individuals may not have the courage or the incentive to introduce something that is missing if they've discovered that it is missing and feels that it's important. But because to introduce something new does require a certain amount of intellectual effort, plus ability, I guess, and familiarity with the running engine of the profession that you're working on, so that you can infiltrate into it. So it has been missing for a long while. And I like to think one of my tasks in the review was to make nature the blanket, if you like, that's her answer. That was the idea in some ways. Now, I wouldn't belittle any idea regarding parts of nature as harvesting property. It's perfectly consistent. But if you nibble away at them, you'll be nibbling away at the blanket. And eventually you have too many pores in it, you'll be in trouble in keeping the cold out. So that's what I'm trying to do in the review. But again, the review, although it was a government review, government's report, there was no way I could avoid doing mathematics in it. So there's plenty of it, but they were in boxes and in star chapters, so that the reader is alerted that outside the boxes there will be not much mathematics. But it is important, even in government reports for the government, it seemed to me that I'm clean with the analysis, not hide behind just words. Get it? Because there may be somebody there, and there are plenty of civil servants who could and can follow the review very easily. You owe it to the reader to be honest and show where the arguments are coming from, rather than being excatator pronouncements coming from the person, from the author.
So you've drawn a variety of influences, but particular ecology, environmental sciences, as well as the full spectrum of social sciences, including economics, but not exclusively so. But I remember having many conversations with you, in which you've talked about your geography teacher at school, and the way that was a formative influence in your ways of thinking.
Yes, absolutely right. Yeah, you do have a terrific memory. That's been a long time ago since I mentioned to you, Bhaskar. But yes, in some ways, I think it was my geography teacher in my middle school. I was 13 to 15 then, for what we call matriculation examinations there in Benares, or in Varanasi. My teacher was a geography teacher, and he was just totally inspiring. Now, I think if I had been a rational agent with self-confidence and thought through how to done geography as my university subject. But in those days, at least in India, if you're reasonably bright or your test results are good, physics is what you do. So I did physics. I sort of sleepwalked into it. I enjoyed it. That was sure, but it never excited me in a way that, because I didn't have sort of a kind of a handle, I can see that somebody like Richard Feynman wouldn't be able to do anything other than physics. They're sort of born into it. I like to think in a far lower level, given my competence relative to Feynman. I was born into geography, but I didn't do it. So in a way, I've been turned into a geographer. You see, the style of my work in recent years has really been much more what the geography looks towards.
It's a very welcoming discipline. Like you, I didn't study any geography, but my colleagues in the department have embraced my lack of training and welcomed me in with open arms. So it's a very welcoming discipline, Partha. Let's move on to the argument of the book, and you sort of touched upon this. One of the central themes, you organize it into two parts. You've got a first part, which is really around the ecological challenge, which you characterize with the impact inequality. And then you talk about what contributes to that and how we might address it. And, put simply, I think what you're saying in the first part is that we're borrowing more from nature than her capacity to renew herself. And this can't be sustained for very much longer. Now, it'd be fair to say that ecologists have been telling us this for a very long time. And, the Club of Rome report was written in 1972. Yeah. In some senses, that insight has been around. But yet it's not been taken very seriously by policymakers. So do you think that's a problem of the science itself or the way in which it's been communicated?
Very lovely question. And I think I have some thoughts on that anyway, so let me try to start. When the Club of Rome was published, and there was, it created quite a bit of stir, even within the economics profession, because it was a direct assault on economics, right? But, and here's the but, which was an important but, the economists would point out, yes, maybe we haven't looked at, they wouldn't say nature, but resources as carefully as we should. But on the other hand, the Club of Rome doesn't think of prices. It was all in stocks. There were no prices at all. So they, in some sense, a central mechanism by which resources get allocated. And you don't have to be an economist to appreciate that. Just a person who buys and sells to recognize that there are adjustment mechanisms, maybe not be very good ones necessarily, and maybe break down in many cases, but there are adjustment mechanisms that institutions that have evolved. So I think the Club of Rome really lost its mind. It didn't have any adherence in the economics profession. It was easy to shoot it down. Now, I'm glad you've asked me this question because it came out about 1972. Now, I was a young lecturer in the London School of Economics, but I was still living in Cambridge. And a colleague of mine, Jeff Heal, who was at that time a fellow of Christ's and a lecturer, we were chatting and we said, well, yeah, maybe there are no prices in there, but at least they're talking about resources. Where are they here in our subject? So we started working on resource economics, if you like. Now, at that time, this is 72, 73, that period, at that time, there was this considerable worry about resources, oil in particular, the oil price. Now, it was worried about it for the wrong reason. Prices had gone up, not because of shortages. It was a coalition at work and creating a monopoly. But never mind. The thought was that we're running out of oil, or at least it wasn't that at all, at least at that time. So we started working on that. And our first book on the subject with Theo was on exhaustible resources, like oil and coal, that sort of thing, without looking at the externalities that their usage creates in the world. So that, and sometime after it came out, about 1980 or so, about 78, just before in those days, the books were published with a huge lag. They used to go to Hong Kong by steamship. And then you get these mile-long galley proofs, and then you send it back. So it was about 2 years before the book came out. So I submitted in 1977 with Jeff Hill. The book came out in 79. Meanwhile, while the book was being published, I chanced upon a book which has influenced me enormously. I mean, completely turned my career around in the sense of moved me in a different direction. It was a book called Ecoscience by Paul Ehrlich, Anne Ehrlich, and John Holdren. I came across it by accident, no reason why I should, but it's a huge tome. And it transformed my ideas. I read it, and I looked at every chapter, whether it was on the water or on what soil or you name it, going through classic, categories of resources. And I tried to model them. And I found that they were actually pretty much the same model, chapter after chapter, even though the instance was different. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that what it alerted me to is that the entire subject is about stocks. Stocks are what we would now call natural capital, nature's capital, as opposed to manufactured capital, like Shara happened to be sitting on. And so we should be discussing stocks rather than flows. Now, many things follow from it, really profound ones. So it says that when we look at the progress or regress of nations or economies, we should not be thinking in terms of flows. GDP is a flow. Even NDP is a flow, net national product. Even that's a flow. So many dollars worth of goods and services per year. It's the per year thing which makes it into a flow. But it's the stock which matters because the stock embeds in it, embodies in it, all possible flows from it, depending on what institutions you have. If you're efficient, you will get more out of that stock than if you're inefficient. You see what I mean? Inefficiency means waste. So if you look at this from that perspective, which I thought was the right perspective, it really does make a difference. And my subsequent work was really concerned with stocks. Now, in a way, it's good news for the economist. It should be no surprise because we think of manufactured capital. We even talk about human capital, education, health, and so forth, which are stocks. We carry them. But stocks can depreciate. When I die, I take my human capital with me, and that's the end of that. So that's real depreciation. And so I could then link the environmental issues with stories of human capital, right? But reconstruct the discussion along the lines of stock management, asset management. Now, one of the things about asset management, and you don't have to be an economist to recognize it, anybody who actually has stocks and shares and knows a little bit about the allocation of investment, knows that you really have to look at competing rates of return on the stocks. So once I realized that, I thought that the whole thing about natural capital is really an asset management problem. And you ought to look at it that way. And that's how this book is written, and certainly my review was written.
So just elaborating on that, one of the questions you asked us is, to reflect on whether we'd rather be alive today or in 1750. You sort of talk about how the global economy has produced for us, higher standards of living, higher levels of prosperity, lower mortality rates, all of our expectations around, our life and the quality of life that we would lead us to suggest that being alive in the 21st century is far better than being alive in 1750. So in some ways, we live in the best of times, but at the same time, you point out how ecologically we're living in the worst of times. And you use Living Planet Index as one illustration of that, but there's a number of other ways in which we can see that. And the insight, I think, there's a graph which is in your original report and reproduced in the book, in which you show how produced capital and human capital are increasing throughout this period. And actually, it's natural capital that is declining, but is invisible. And this is your point, which you made earlier about embeddedness, because the economy is embedded in nature, but that particular variable is invisible in the way in which we measure prosperity. Right. Prosperity is measured by what's going up above the line, and what's hidden is the impact that that's having on nature below the line. So, I think that's a really profound insight. And as you said, it really challenges the externality model in the way in which economists have dealt with the nature question. You have both here and earlier talked about inclusive wealth as a much better measure. How do we get that more visible in the ways in which finance ministers think?
Yeah.
So just as a reflection, I remember waiting for this in the budget speech that Rishi Sunak made literally the week after your report was launched. And you issued this to him. He had commissioned the report, or his office had commissioned the report. The budget speech that year made no mention of nature. And it's ironic, this disconnect. And it's kind of illustrative of the challenge that you've been grappling with.
Yeah, well, maybe I should have written a better review, but maybe the answer I couldn't really Many thoughts going through my mind while you're mentioning this. It's going to be hard for me to collect them into a 2 minute, 3 minutes response. But all the measures that we use to describe the economy, and they are not the measures which we use to describe our household, by the way. I want to make a distinction here, because our practices are different. In the former case, in the case of the economy, are concerned with, if you like, the final outputs, final goods and services that are produced. But the underbelly of those activities are natural resources. Okay. Even after all, if you work on deep poverty, as I did in the 1990s, even the human labor is built on nature, because, I mean, of course, that's obvious to everybody, but my work was going to show that if you don't eat much, your productivity is low, and then you can't produce enough to feed yourself to be able to be productive. So the idea that if they only save more, they can do, well, there may not be any cuts on savings, availability of savings. So it's the underbelly that matters. So economic language has evolved over the past 250 years in looking at the final outputs, net national product, or gross national product, because nobody mentions depreciations anyway. I mean, nobody estimates it with any care. And what really I wanted to do in my work was to look at the underbelly and to construct the final economy, the final goods and services from the bottom up. So it's like using your microscope down under rather than from the top. That I know that sounds a bit vague, but I'm trying to make it not so vague in my book. That's the idea, to look at the sources of our activities, human activity. And in my earlier work, I used to work a good deal on human labor. This one, I've been looking at the output that human labor and manufactured capital and ideas, technological progress, science together make for output. But they all require, the bottom line is nature. And the question is that use efficient? If not, why not? So that's the economic problem, as I see it.
We move on towards the second half of the book to tell us about your thoughts around some of the ways in which we might respond. And one of those centers around what I guess I would call norm-based behavior. So the consumption choices that we make are influenced by preferences that are imposed upon us by others. You also talk about reproductive choice and how social norms replicate themselves in society, and the importance of demography, therefore, in our thinking about the solutions. But you also talk about the ways in which societies around the world often value nature for its own sake, intrinsically. And you have a chapter at the end when you discuss that in much greater detail. So the value of that norm-based approach and trying to reinforce social norms is as important as price signals. But what's your sense on that kind of that choice?
Well, you know, we are in a very privileged situation where we have time to reflect what academics do. That's the privilege that we enjoy. We think about things that many people reserve for only Sundays. And on Mondays to Saturdays, they will think differently. Now, so we have this luxury. And I think one of the causes of dissonance is the fact that the way the institutions have evolved, it doesn't really pick up signals from the environment adequately. We would respond to the signals if they were there, by the way, provided it hit our budget. That's the key thing, obviously. Otherwise, it becomes a Sunday thing. You say, well, it doesn't hit my budget, but of course we should care about it. So let's go and do something about it, plant a tree or whatever. So there is a certain amount of schizophrenia in all of us. No question about that. It could become routine if that could be priced. If the natural goods, nature's goods and services could be priced, so that we feel the pinch. Now, when I say price, I don't necessarily mean having to pay in cash. if there is a ration on something, you feel the pinch. Because you can't get more than what you would otherwise want. So there is an implicit price. So there are many ways of making people pay the price even without they don't have to pay pay the price, so to speak, up front. You see what I mean? So we haven't been able to do that with nature in any general wide sense. Now, can I just take a couple of minutes off to respond to something that you had asked, but I hadn't responded to, which is one of the things that we did and I tried to do in the book, and that relates to your question regarding the Club of Rome. One reason, I said one reason the Club of Rome didn't get any traction amongst economists is that it had no prices. So in a sense, they could just dismiss it and saying, well, how do you know about that? Okay, so things are going under, then why aren't their prices doing something about it? And they would say, well, if it's going under, maybe it needs to go under because we're getting other things, like tapping nature to produce manufactured goods, which of course has a sense of its own. And we have been practicing it ever since the first tree that was cut to produce, to have fire. Well, that thing, that's going on all the time. I think where the impact inequality really makes its mark is to identify the factors that are governing the demand we make for nature and nature's regenerative rate, namely her ability to reproduce or regenerate. And if there's a gap between the two, and if the gap is that the demand exceeds the supply, we have a problem. Now, I don't think the Club of Rome have any sense of being able to articulate it in that way. And until you do that, it's just an arithmetic accounting, and you don't know how to handle it. And the economists literally dismissed this. I remember in 1972 here in the economics faculty, several of our economists said that, if there are no prices at all, how do we, you have to have a deep account of it. And I think there was a justification for it. So observation that we might be trashing nature, that's not Club of Rome. That goes back to Mahatma Gandhi. Lord knows how many. Recently, I saw it my wife showed me a passage in Dante's Inferno, which talks about nature being, that it's a sin against God. The language differs, but the sentiment remains the same, that we may be trashing nature. And we're looking at the early Middle Age period. So, yes, people have been concerned about these matters from time to time. No, mostly as we go about our daily life, it doesn't appear in our calculation. And the question is, why doesn't it? How do you reconcile these two threads of our thinking, both of which are legitimate? And I guess that's what the economist's job is, or should have been. And my work was really designed to do that. The economists really didn't engage in it. And I think one reason maybe, and I can't, is that they didn't engage with ecologists. Now, I was hugely influenced by Paul Ehrlich, largely because of the book I read. And then some years later, when I joined the Stanford faculty, I met him and we became lifelong friends. He's one of my closest friends. And we worked together. We influenced each other. He taught me a lot more ecology and introduced me to ecologists. Of course, I gravitated towards ecology in a big way. And that's where my interest in geography, of course, now gets together. So in a way, it's an integrated intellectual enterprise. Geography has this habit of spinning subdisciplines, has always had it. And ecology is one of them. It's an offshoot. It's something that is spun out of geographical concerns. So, and I like to think demography is, I'm trying to do that. And so can I just come to a point about demography, because this is, since you raised it, the impact inequality, which is really talking about the demand we make, which is a flow demand per year. And at the global level, let's say we can use this impact inequality for local communities as well, but that's not a problem. I'm just concentrating on the global one. Global demand for goods and services, nature's goods and services versus nature's ability to regenerate those services. Now, strictly speaking, the impact inequality is not one inequality. There are zillions of inequalities depending on which good and which service you're talking about. I was aggregating, so it was like pretend that there is something called the good or service, an index of that, and then the comparison of the two. Now, one of the factors in it, of course, population. Standard of living is another factor. Technology is another factor. Institutions is another factor. But population is also one, because the demand, one of the factors for demand is how many people there are, keeping all else constant. Okay? You can talk about adjustment between population and standard of living and so forth. But that's a dynamical question. At any moment of time, you have an accounting framework, you have population in it. And yet nobody wanted to discuss population. So as though one of the factors in the inequality is not to be touched. Now, the one thing I learned from my father's feet was nothing is untouchable in intellectual inquiry. That is just a sin. I mean, he would call it a sin because. So of course, I wanted to please my father, which is a very natural thing to do. I would pick up these areas which nobody wants to touch. So hence my interest in demography, because you get that wrong, you're really getting a lot of things wrong. It's one of the factors. There's no ifs and buts about it. On the other hand, of course, even as I was beginning to work on it, it became much more and more a socially taboo subject. You read the United Nations, various components of the United Nations, there's notions of demographic research, and then basically it's not on. So that's been another area in which I tried to make that a reasonable thing to research on. And it's important to me because demography is actually missing. In the University of Cambridge, for example, there is no professorship of demography. Historical demography, yes, that's different, but not, and this is true in most universities. Why? I think it's a missed opportunity in a big way, and I like to think we will try and correct it. That's good. And of course, you are Pro Vice Chancellor for Education. There you are. There you are. So,
thank you, Partha. So, Partha, I'm going to invite our students who've been reading the book closely over the last 3 days. So, just for the audience, in case you didn't know, the publishers released the book only on the 24th of July. And I'd like to think, Partha, this is your first outing.
Absolutely.
And I'm delighted that it's...
It will be the last.
I'm sure this is the first of many. I'm sure there will be many to follow. But our students have been very diligent. They had a deadline on Friday and have been working all weekend to read the book and have come up with a set of insights. And they'd like to put some questions to you. So I'm going to hand over to two who have prepared the comments on behalf of the students, Candace and Michael, who are now going to join us on the floor with their initial feedback from the students, and then we're going to open it up for conversation from the audience. Okay. So, Michael, are you going first? Candace is going first. So, you want to take my mic?
Thank you, Professor Bhaskar. And thank you, Professor Dasgupta. It's a bit surreal because we just cite him in our papers. And thank you for... Is the mic working? It's not.
Use mine. I think that's working.
And if I switch it off or something. Jack, will you have
Test.
that?
It's working.
Okay.
And thanks for walking us through the chapters of that book. And one of my favorites is when you started your preface with a very vivid visualization of a coin with like the building and industries, but at the back of it is like nature being destroyed. In terms of leadership, your book and shaping narratives, what inspired you to write this book now, and what do you hope it achieves, especially for conservation leaders like us, and how we can help shape narratives like economic narratives and bring your book's insight into real policy and practice in our countries?
Well, I'd be the wrong person to answer because it's something, your book is essentially a grammar. I'm an economist and an academic. I don't have your expertise at all. I produce something which could be used as a grammar, and then it's just a first step. Policies or activities that NGOs might take will be they'll be picked up, not necessarily from the book. The book gives an intellectual argument for justifying the pressures that NGOs, for example, would like to make. That's the idea. The urgency of the matter is very important too. And one of the things I do is to give statistics in the book, statistics which relate to the theoretical arguments. Simply to say that there's an impact inequality doesn't convey so much as to be able to say that the ratio between demand and supply for nature's goods and services is at the least 1.7. Now that really gives you a hint as to how far we've gone. That kind of thing. And there is a literature on that. And this, by the way, these figures are, of course, extremely approximate. Goes without saying. But one reason they're particularly approximate is that empirical work of this kind is really rather new. And estimates are bound to be very, very approximate. I mean, it's not like measuring GDP, which is a lousy measure, misses everything, but the measure, once you've decided what you're going to measure, is done extremely well. Because you've got about 70, 80 years of practice with millions and millions of government dollars to fund the national accounts. So you must recognize that the next time somebody tells you, oh, these are too approximate, I mean, why should we believe them? Well, you say, well, why should that? People who could have said the same thing 70 years previously about GDP because they were very approximate. If you, Kuznets's first estimates make your sort of blood coil. They're so crude, but they were in the 1930s, actually. So there we are. There's that aspect too.
Thank you very much, sir. One of the fascinating things that you said, and of course it's on the cover of the book, that a lot of times some of the economic measures that we take or we use is just like a football team, whereby a football team only takes on the goals it scores, but never looks at the goals it concedes. So we could be losing right through without actually knowing what we're doing. So that was really, really impressive on the book. Our second question is going to look at the barriers, the trade-offs, and different leverage points that we can look at. And the question was, how do you see as the biggest barrier stopping governments and businesses from integrating natural capital into decisions and policies? What's the biggest barrier there? And just a follow-up to that, in the context where large-scale infrastructure or extractive industries promise short-term gains, how should leaders weigh those choices against long-term natural capital?
I'm sorry, at my age, my memory is at fault. Can you just repeat the first part?
Yeah, the first one is, how do you see is the biggest barrier stopping governments and businesses from integrating natural capital?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. A few years ago, and I mentioned this in my book, there was an article and a book written by two gentlemen in the United States who wanted to argue against everything we're discussing now in terms of the direction of economic progress by saying, what are the forgotten technological change? And look, the labor cost in producing X, Y, and Z has dropped dramatically. And he gave huge numbers of examples of the labor cost, the time cost of producing things. Shrimp farming was one of his major examples. So the idea was to measure a unit of output of a particular industry sector in terms of the human time that was required. Now you can see immediately how far off he was. Because shrimp farming, of course, is one of the worst examples you could use to say that there's been such technological progress that you eat up as much as you can of shrimp because the externalities involved in production are completely ignored, which is what means that there is also nature involved in the production of shrimp, which is ignored in it. So you get into very bad habits when you've got this kind of reasoning. These are really very practical measures, and it, of course, lifts itself at the highest level when we talk about economic progress of comparative economic performances of different countries. The language is entirely in terms of GDP, maybe employment as well, but so much as comparisons. There are two types of comparisons we are always using, which is one is time series. How are we doing today as compared to yesterday? And what are the prospects tomorrow? And the other is cross-country to see how are we doing relative to some other, depending on these are the two types of comparisons that we make. And in every case, the ones that I see have no bearing on the fact that, no sensitivity of the fact that the measures that are used to make the comparisons that do not have nature in. And that's the same thing. It's a pervasive wrong grammar being used, wrong language, if you like, being used in discussing these matters. So this is not trivial. It's one level it is, because that's saying you just, of course, these resources are these factors of production or consumption are not being taken into account. But the far-reaching implications is what I've been concerned to expose. They're not just Sunday discussions. It's really about every day, and you just go off in the wrong tangent. Now, here's the other thing, which is that you make a mistake. When I say you, I mean this economic system makes an error. Let's say a bias against one particular factor of production, against it, say in the case of this nature. Then you then ask why. Then the answer would be, of course, because nature is cheaper in the market. But then you say, well, if entrepreneurs innovate, well, they'll be innovating and in directions in which you economize on scarce goods, not cheap goods. So that tells you that it's not just current use, but future uses are going to be biased because your direction of technological change is biased against nature. So you talk about labor-saving innovations, capital-saving innovations, but nobody talks about nature-saving innovation because entrepreneurs have no incentive to do that. Why would you wish to innovate to economize on a cheap factor of production relative to an expensive factor of production? So these are nitty-gritty things, but together they add up to a vision of the economy, a picture of the economy, places where we would to go, which can be very misleading. And now, second question. Sorry.
So the second question stems from even the fact that you gave the example of shrimp fishing. So shrimp fishing, as well as large extractive industries and infrastructure development and all these things that promise short-term gains. So how do you suggest leaders in conservation and other fields can leverage on the points?
Yeah, look, you're asking sort of a $64 million question to be solved that in those days, tough questions like that. I have no answer to it. Largely because if the entire system of incentives misses out on certain factors because they're underpriced or unpriced, then all that the discussion is going to be that. And no individual will, other than deep conservationists, will like to do something about it in their own life. But that's small potatoes. You're recreating a better garden or a local community garden and so forth. But that's a small potato. Now, it's not small potato which we add up to all the communities, but that's a different matter. But if individually, you're not going to make a huge difference in the global picture. But that is the problem. I don't see any answer to it other than the economist's answer, which is in some way or the other, we have to find a way to make nature more expensive. More expensive, not, as I said, not in terms of actually having to pay, but to feed the pinch. And the pinch we feel is typically, as I say, on Sundays, because that's when you're thinking more leisurely about things. But on a day-to-day basis, you have so many pressures on your time and effort, and you have to economize. You have a household budget to manage, and so forth. So there's no answer to it. This is, from me, there's no answer. We just have to move towards creating an economy in which nature has a price we pay. We feel it to bite. And it's very hard. It's probably impossible in many ways, part of it because of the externalities that you're all familiar with, and that goes without saying. I think there's another reason that may have, and I'm not a historian to be able to speak with any authority, but the fact is that so much of biodiversity and therefore primary products came from the tropics, and the rich economies are temperate economies to begin with, at least. So in a sense, you're outsourcing your biodiversity needs, and you don't necessarily feel the pinch there. Or of course, you don't feel the pinch. You might feel the pinch when supply sources dry up elsewhere. Goes without saying. But then in the old days, they would say, well, let's move to another supply source. What about Western America or South America, Latin America? That's what, historically speaking, that's what's been happening as resource scarcity. But now we are in a world in which, because of the terms of the numerical estimates that I've reported, the 1.7 and so forth, we're running out of that space. We have run out of that space. And the Earth being finite has a... Now, none of this, to get back to your very good question about the couple of roads, found any expression in the couple of roads. That's why I didn't take it seriously then, and I wouldn't take it seriously now.
Thank you, Professor Dasgupta. And you've also touched on substitute resources. Yes, it's working. Thank you. You've also touched on substitute resources in the book and in this conversation. So in terms of valuing nature in the global south, how can natural capital approaches be made both applicable and fair to biodiversity-rich nations in the global south, or there's strong pressure to develop at the same time reduce poverty? And what practical steps can these countries adapt such approaches without harming livelihoods or excluding local communities?
That really is a mean question to ask. I really can't give a satisfactory answer to it. But to point to a couple of things which really we tend to overlook, which is when we think of economic development, and we should be thinking about it, goes without saying, and that there are poor countries. Many of the development policies that were followed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even now, today, are quite anti-poor. And they're not anti-poor because you could be giving in one hand and taking away from the other. That's what I'm talking about. That is the basis on which rural poor live. If you were to knock out their capital stocks, the main capital stock would be ecological stock or natural capital, then you can compensate, but then you should recognize that you're actually compensating and you don't know whether the compensation equals what you're taking out. So I think there is a kind of, I've seen this in many contexts where the question of poverty looms up to close the discussion, because it's still embarrassing. How can you say that I'm in favor of policies or protecting this means some very poor person is affected adversely? That's unthinkable. Goes without saying you don't want to do that. You could talk about compensation from the rich to the poor and so forth, but by then you have lost the argument. And what I'm trying to say is that very often, the examples that I know very well in rural communities, the idea that development is good for them is not on, in many cases, because you're taking away things from them. Now, of course, in terms of the units that you use to measure success, it is on. Because they'll say, what the hell, look, they're richer now. But the community from which the community may be losing stocks of capital, which are not recorded at all. And one of the things that we need to do is to think very hard on that. And that may not be recorded for quite some time because the pinch is not felt. You see, you can deteriorate a capital stock for quite a while and beef up your output before, of course, it sinks to the ground by, it flips into a bad state. But so long as it doesn't do that, and you haven't taken note of the natural capital, you can go on saying, what are you complaining about? People who are poor are now becoming middle class. And to say anything against the process suggests that you're against the outcome. And then that makes you a bad person. Because that you can't possibly dislike the outcome, but the process which has led to that outcome can be criticized. And I think many of the policies which have been extremely damaging to the world's poorest. I mean, dams are a very good example. There are plenty of articles and books that have been written by anthropologists on dams. And of course, economists have also studied dams to find that actually the productivity of dams is negative in very, very many cases. In fact, there's one article, I think it was Esther Duflo's paper, which seemed to argue that there's hardly a dam which has a positive rate of return when you calculate if I remember correctly, I may be wrong, but I recall that she had an article called Dams. And, I think she meant two things.
Thank you, sir. That's good. Very interestingly, that when you mention about sometimes we integrate with communities, and as you rightfully say, like you only measure the capital wealth, and then we tend to forget the cultural value that is lost as we are taking like new things, new development, and all those things. So our next question stems on the limits, equity, and intrinsic worth. Natural capital frameworks assign economic value to ecosystems. Where do you see the limits of this approach? Are there aspects of biodiversity that we should never try to price? And how do you reconcile this with the idea that nature has intrinsic worth beyond human use?
Again, a marvelous question. Thank you very for asking. And it's a very complicated set of issues. How do I price? The idea that you can price all natural capital is, of course, completely bogus. You can't. Goes without saying. That's for sure. It's a first cut because so many that could be measured aren't and could be used profitably, if you like, beneficially, are not. That's why it's the first base that you hit. Okay. But there's a second and a third base, and then a home plate as well. There you need to go beyond prices, goes without saying. And then you make distinctions between the way that institutions have always done. Communities have certain no-go areas, for example. Every community has that. And the sacred grove, for example, would be, there are plenty of sacred groves throughout the world. Communities feel that those are sacrosanct, they're not touched. So it's like saying there's an infinite price for it. You don't have to make it infinite, but sufficiently high that you don't go. That's another way of expressing the fact that there's no entry. Or if there's an entry, we do that. In India, for example, certain trees are sacred. And many societies have that. In other societies like Benin, I think I've got some examples there where they have sacred groves like nobody's business, half an acre, quarter of an acre, and so on. So there are ways by which communities have protected, whether they were protecting nature in the language that we're using is questionable. They probably didn't. They may have been, I don't know what it was, but they have gods built fences to keep people out, so to speak, or to husband and to treat it with care. So we're not unaware of the fact that you could, at one end, think of nature in those extreme expressions, like sacredness and so forth. I used to think that such expressions of sacredness are alien to Western culture. But I'm now more and more convinced that they're not, because I've been writing about it, but nobody seems to be writing me nasty letters saying that you're going gaga in your old age. That is not what you're talking about sacredness. It's just, look, sacredness, we're really talking about the force of your interest in a particular resource. That's another way of thinking. And if it doesn't have a price, then you institute, or typically you don't put a price to it because it's like selling your own soul. But you can have, quotas, country restrictions, prohibitions are expressions of that idea that you want to make. That is an extreme form of scarcity.
Well, thank you very much for those answers. Now I think we should open the questions to the floor. Yes.
Thank you, Candice, Michael. Thank you so much for leading us through those questions. We're going to open this up for the audience to ask questions. So I don't know whether we need one microphone to go around the room in order to ask questions, and Partha will do the answering. So I'll just direct the traffic, as it were. I see your hand right here.
Thank you so much for the conversation. Really happy to have you here and enjoying it immensely. So my name is Julie Dimitrovic. I'm at Fauna and Flora, and I work on the business and nature team. So trying to integrate corporate decision-making to think about nature-related investment decisions and how it affects natural capital. And I suppose one of the questions that was already asked to you is how do we get natural capital integrated thinking across the value chain of companies? It's the $64 million question. And I recognize that it's very difficult to implement on a global scale to change the economic system. But trying to be an optimist, I'm wondering, what do you think the levers of change are possible for people like us to do?
Well, thank you very much. I should have addressed this. There's so many thoughts that go through one's mind to a specific question that may not hit the target. I think it's important to create, first of all, as a practical matter, to create national accounts which reflect what we're discussing. That's the first. You need to know what's going on before you can start talking about policy, because you then need to know why what's going on is what's going on. You need to know the process, and then you think in terms of policy. And often we don't have the former, so it's hard to know that. If you have national statistics, which say nothing about natural capital, you're hardly going to have much in the way of a debate on public policy, other than vague statements like we have looked at after nature or the river stinks at the moment or something. Then, of course, these are piecemeal things. So I think the first thing to do is to have them in the national accounts. Now, here's the thing. The national accounts usually have a prices tag to it. You take it well. It would be in price terms. In the natural capital case, the columns that you will have will not be necessarily priced, but in quantity terms. And you track the quantities, see what is being endangered. Ecologists do that all the time. They are constantly saying, well, this wetland is no longer as healthy as it used to be 20 years ago. And how do they know? They know it by having monitored the services these wetlands typically provide and whether the quality of the services has been declining or not. Now, these are the kinds of hard pieces of information that actually national statistics ought to have, or regional statistics or departmental statistics ought to have. So the idea is not necessarily to have a price for everything, goes without saying, it would do that, but to be a description, an intertemporal description of stocks. But I come to the same thing, namely stocks that matter, not flows. And we're far away from that because national statistics are not given in terms of stocks. And, a few years ago, I tried to, in the work that I was doing with Ken Arrow and a few others, Carl Mailer, myself, Arrow, and 2 graduate students, in trying to estimate inclusive wealth. Now, inclusive wealth, by the way, in case you know what it is, the idea is that you create a value of the stocks that an economy has, of all the stocks. And that's what wealth is. If you ask yourself, what is the wealth of your household? You'll be saying, do I own a house? And if I so, what's the value of the house? And if you're really smart, you'll say, well, I should add my human capital. In other words, the projected income stream, then discount it to the present. And so that'll be part of your stock and so forth, okay? And national accountants should have measures of stock. And we don't have that. And if you can't price it, as I say, do it in terms of quantities. And you've got to get a long way off, because at least they are giving you a signal of the characteristics of the economy as you're moving through time. Some of them will be in terms of prices, others will be in terms of quantities, or a mixture thereof.
If there are colleagues online who'd like to ask questions, Michael has very kindly agreed to read them out to me. So if you're attending this online and on Zoom, please do bring your questions in the chat and then we'll try and pick them up. I think I have a question here in the audience and then one at the back. Why don't we take them both? So, and I'll make a note if I need to.
Thanks so much. That was very interesting. Well, this question has partly been answered in over various questions, but I'm keen to know if any of the governments, whether at the national level or, this was the report was commissioned by the government, but has there been any level of engagement in terms of factoring natural capital into the GDP or into policy, whether in the UK or elsewhere, even at a sub-regional level? And do you see any scope for that, given right-wing governments, given the state of economies of many countries, so to speak? So I would be keen to.
But I don't answer yet. I'm asking for a second question from the back. I'll remind you about the question.
Exactly. My memory lapse is phenomenal now.
Hi, it was wonderful to listen to this conversation. My name is Sayu. I'm a research assistant in environmental economics. I had a question about demography since you mentioned it. One sort of important trend that's happening right now in many developed countries, but also in many regions of developing, like rapidly developing countries, is the fertility rate and birth rates. How do you think that maybe interacts with natural capital? Of course, it's obvious how it interacts with consumption and that generally. But I'm curious to know how the interaction with natural capital is.
Thank you very much. The first question, that you won't believe it, I remembered it. Yeah.
Your question.
The answer is yes. Now, I wouldn't say this has anything to do with my review. It's just that the timing may have been right. And then the other thing is that the governments had already begun making those moves that they have. So they don't identify this with the review. It's what's been happening. There are countries which have moved to preparing national accounts, which take nature really quite seriously, as far as it's possible, given the data. Remember, much of the data are actually missing. So we're looking at a program of reporting, which involves investment in creating, to enable that kind of information to be gathered. Okay? As I was saying, some years ago when I was writing a paper with Arrow and others, we looked at trying to get measures of fish stocks. Most countries didn't have any. So that's the kind of problem. Now, this has it eased. There are plenty of countries which are doing that. Costa Rica is one. Chile is another. New Zealand is moving in that direction. And there may be many more. I don't know how far we've progressed in the UK, but I think UK now, the National Accounts Office is now introducing natural capital in it in one way or the other. I'm not really an expert on it, but I'm quite hopeful that this will happen. And it's happening because the new generation of people working in these and national accounts are concerned about it, or they feel that there is a gap. And of course, every young person wants to do something new. And if he or she can bring some new thoughts to the department he or she has there joined, they would like to do that. And I think the time is right. Nobody's going to say, no, we're not going to have it. That's not possible. But as I say, it's still limited. And again, the other thing is, of course, so one thing is to collect the data and the other to report it, but the other is to have the language that is used for development purposes, policy purposes, incorporates it in a seamless way. And there's a gap there because the ministries are going to be using the language of yesterday because they were trained yesterday. That goes without saying. So I think it's one of those diffusion processes where new entrants who have some understanding of these issues bring those concerns and abilities into account. This was about demography.
So declining fertility rates, birth rates around the world, particularly in the advanced industrial world, and clearly they have an impact on the demographic momentum. So
that's for sure. And there are many, many reasons that economic demographers have identified as to what the response would be. And so we didn't go into that. It's pretty well known now. You're quite right. The real problem is, first, there are two things. First is the stock of humans to begin with. We're now about nearly 8.2 billion, if not more. And one should think a little bit about as to what trend we should be thinking in terms of whether that population can sustainably live at a, hopefully, higher standard, growing standard of living. And no work is done other than the few calculations I've done in my own work, because it seems to me that's the right question to ask. Secondly, despite the fall in fertility rates in most of the world, I mean, if you look regionally, large regions, then pretty much all countries are below 2.1 total fertility rate, even, okay? Other than one region, that's Africa, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and that we are still looking at about 4+. Now, the explosive between that population growth, a declining ecosystem basis, because, as I say, the ratio there is not 1.7, but it's about 1.3, the ratio of demand and supply. So we're not looking at plenty of natural resources there. They can be looking at a place which is already overburdened. So there's that. And they're very poor. That's a it's a dynamite, in my judgment, particularly given that the rest of the world is enjoying a soft living, beginning to lead to softer and softer living. And that is, I think, very hard on them. And this problem really needs to be looked at by aid agencies, but of course, much more importantly, by themselves. But if the political leaderships in Africa refuse to countenance discussion on this, saying that this is another racist or whatever, this is not a racist. We're really looking about the future of the people inhabiting that place. That's the issue. And I think we social scientists ought to be absolutely candid about them. And there we have a problem, serious problem, and it needs to be tackled. Now, here's where I found, this is one of the outcomes of my review, of these meetings that we had, Zoom meetings and so forth. I came to a rather disturbing and possibly very controversial viewpoint, observation about whom I was talking to. And it may be controversial among you too, but let me try it out anyway, because that's the impression I had. The people who are running these major institutions, the World Bank, IMF, African Development Bank, countries run African countries, the people who run African countries, I mean, the intellectual leaders there, they're all the same. They've all gone to Harvard Kennedy School, or Princeton. Of course, I'm saying it in a colorful kind of way, but there's truth in that. It's not a question of whether you're an African, whether you're an American, you're an Indian or not. It's a club. They know each other from a long time ago, and the conversations that take place are ones which they find very okay. And they're all, of course, very successful people. They're like us around this room. And so for them, there's a language that such things are possibly insulting to this particular culture. Who decides that? You're doing it, and that table. And I think that's a very dangerous thing, for us to know what's the culture of another country. Given the fact that what you're really concerned about is the well-being of the people who are actually on the receiving end of the development process. I'm talking to the 800 billion women of reproductive age in the world who do not have access to family planning, safe family planning and reproductive health thing. Now and then what's the expenditure we spend on that? In this country, the aid, less than 1%. The OECD gives very low weight to these issues. So you can convert the demographic problem to a women's rights problem very easily. Nobody does that. Because the women who are representing them are not part of it. They have 2 children, if that. And they're running around from one conference to another, from the World Bank to IMF or whatever. I mean, this is a fact. We all are like that. We all are, embedded in a particular network of thought, of activities. And so it's easy to miss that and think that you're representing somebody, but who you may not be. Typically will not be, because the people who are involved in the decision-making are from the same club. Think about it, and you'll probably find lots of examples in cases that you're.
But I'll take a question from the online audience, which sort of resonates a little bit with what you're saying.
Professor Dasgupta.
The sort of self-reinforcing nature of thought. A question online which resonates a little bit with what you've just been saying.
Okay.
The self-enforcing nature of closed circles, clubs of thought, which kind of reinforce each other and they don't necessarily challenge each other. So there's a question online about the obsession with GDP. And again, it's this failure to think differently. And I want to link that a little bit with timing. You had the unfortunate timing of COVID alongside the publication of your report. other attempts, the famous economics of biodiversity report that Pavan Sukhdev led.
Who?
Pavan Sukhdev, and came out in 2008, and 1 year later we went into the global economic recession. So finance ministers were completely obsessed with GDP because they wanted to restore growth.
Sure.
Post-COVID, everyone was obsessed with GDP. They wanted to restore growth. So is there a timing challenge here? Because these ideas have resonated elsewhere, and they just come out at the wrong time. So I'm going to just ask you to reflect on that as a final question. It's a variation of a question that was asked online by one of our listeners. But is that obsession with GDP growth partly linked with the unfortunate timing of these very profound insights that have come out from time to time, that just landed at the wrong time in human history?
Yeah, well, I could. That's a very good observation and a question. I wouldn't be able to answer as to whether it's a rare time, the wrong time in the human history. I don't have much of a clue about that. But we do have I think it's always useful when thinking about an economy, a global economy or a national economy, to think about a household. How would a household think about how to allocate its resources over time? And if it had a perspective in the future as to say whether the household feels is better off now than it was before. But the first thing the household would be asking would not be about how much income that's something, as to whether, if they, for example, lost their home, then even if the income is rising, they will know that something's awry. So a household will be concerned with the stocks of capital, the assets that it owns. Does it own the land? If you talk to fishermen, you talk to agriculturalists, farmers, they will be talking about their assets, literally their assets. The fisherman gets very worried, absolutely sunk, if the boat on which his entire livelihood depends springs a leak. And that's the first thing to do, is to repair that leak. Otherwise, tomorrow there is no fish to be caught. So households work on, depend on their stocks and are very conscious about them. We, those of us who are in this discussion here, are not so concerned about stocks because we have a return our human capital in the form of our salaries, or for young people with a scholarship and so forth. Those are all returns on capital, the capital asset that you embody. And so you're looking at a world from a different perspective, in the sense of, is it springing a leak, or is there a fire, or is, see what I mean? Most people the world really worry about the stocks of capital that they have, but our language doesn't handle that. And we keep on coming to the same thing. I've been repeating myself in many ways over this issue, largely because many of the questions are really directed at that conundrum. How do we convert the discussion away from flows, particularly a bad flow, indication of bad in the sense of bad indicator of anything, GDP, into stocks, which then include the depreciation of assets or destruction of assets as we move through time. And I think the poorest people in the world, I do know, because I have read quite a bit of anthropology of deep poverty, it's the assets that they worry about constantly. Because there's no obvious market price to use to think in terms of income. We are looking at subsistence farmers, subsistence fishermen. They're concerned with whether there are fish in the coastline to be able to fish. That's a stock. We moved away from that largely because of a very successful move towards market economies. We can afford to move away from stocks to the final outputs that the stocks are yielding through the market prices. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I read at least the psychology of age. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. I don't know if it'll ever happen because we're so ingrained in it. And there's a stickiness of these frameworks. Today's decision makers are yesterday's students, and yesterday's students were being taught by yesterday's professors. And they're carrying that human capital into their work, and then so forth. And introducing new ideas, overhauling a system, of course, can't be done over immediately. But if we're lucky, we can chip away a language, a grammar, to introduce these notions that we've been discussing this afternoon and make economics look very different. The fault is not in economics. The fault is in the way we have practiced it. We simply ignored this. Economics has always been about asset management. I mean, Adam Smith talked about the wealth of nations. He wasn't writing about the GDP of nations. And the wealth is the value of the assets that the economy has. And I'm interpreting him literally now. And in some sense, the wealth is the real thing, the real phenomenon. The other is the epiphenomenon. And the epiphenomenon can lead you astray. And I think it has in a big, big way.
Partha, thank you. I think we must unfortunately leave the conversation here, but I want to firstly thank you first for agreeing so readily to take part in this conversation, for stimulating our thinking so much in the book that you've written, and I really would encourage those who haven't read it yet to dip into it and read it. It's a very compelling read. It's very accessible, and you've converted 600 pages of your very technical report into something which is far more accessible. So I can see that this is going to be read much more widely. For those who want to see the report, it's still available online. 600 pages, lots of technical appendices. It's a fascinating read. We are going to move on to a reception next door. Partha has very kindly agreed to sign some books. So I want to thank Rosebell and Hyson in particular, but all the students on the MPhil for coordinating this event. I want to thank our colleagues at CCI, Jack in particular, helping us a lot with the logistics of this event, and the Department of Geography and CCI both sponsoring the drinks and reception, which awaits us outside. So please do join us outside. But I'll hand back to you, Rosebell, for final words.
On behalf of the Conservation Leadership Class, thank you so much for such a stimulating discussion. I think we've all picked such interesting metrics that we'll sit down and reflect on and think about as we continue along this journey. So thank you so much for making the time to come and meet with us. It really means a lot to us. For our online audience, thank you for participating and being a part of the journey with us. Unfortunately, on your side, it comes to an end, but I hope that you've been able to see the code that is available in case you want a copy of the book. It's up on the screen. And for our in-person attendees, the MPhil class has prepared a wonderful reception for you outside. So we're welcoming all of you to take a part of this. And there'll be a book signing that will be going on. So if you have a copy of your book, we're going to set up a separate site where you can get your book signed if you have it with you. So thank you so much for being a part of this, and see you on the other side.